to the program, I just want to say that, in our faith, the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, he identified our proximity to Allah, our closeness and nearness to Allah based on our character. And character is very important. So, before we begin the discussion, I pray to Allah that Allah beautifies our character. May Allah beautify all of us internally and externally by His grace. Nowadays, we're at home, there is a lot of stress factors or increased levels of stress and anxiety. There's a lot of uncertainty, but by the grace of Allah, I know you've been remaining strong, and all of us, our trust in Allah has been great, and may Allah increase us in our trust in Him. But at the same time, we want to address a topic that, us at CARE Georgia, although CARE Georgia is the Georgia chapter on the Council on American Islamic Relations, the largest civil rights and advocacy, Muslim civil rights and advocacy organization in the country. Yet we do get calls on a weekly basis that are disturbing because they relate to domestic abuse and domestic violence, which are very concerning. And we have the pleasure of working with a fabulous and amazing organization, Noor Family Services, and they focus on empowering our families, dealing with domestic abuse, dealing with domestic violence, with professionalism, with faith, with integrity, alhamdulillah. So again, as I mentioned, I am blessed today to have with me my sister, Sister Fakiha Khan. Sister Fakiha, if you can please kindly, introduce yourself to the audience, and also let us know, how are you doing amongst everything that's happening? How are you? How's your family?
Well, assalamu alaikum, first of all, and thank you very much for having me. Let's see, I will introduce myself first. My name is Fakiha. I am by profession an attorney. I'm currently, so I'm one of the co-founders of, excuse me, Noor Family Services, and served as the on-staff attorney for several years. Have recently stepped down, and now it is Aisha Rahman who is the attorney on staff. And I have taken on a role on the board, and I am now the director of outreach. So that's what I do. And let's see, how have I been doing? It has been a stressful time. It has been incredibly stressful. I've got 3 kids at home with nothing to do but drive me up the wall. So, but we're persevering. It's been all, counting our blessings, and all things considered, we're doing very well. Thank you.
Thank you. Alhamdulillah. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for being with us today. And I look forward to a beneficial conversation for all of us, inshallah. So before I get started, as I mentioned, when it comes to family, the threshold or the measuring stick for our nearness to Allah, the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, he said, it's how we deal with our family. It's our character. And we know within Islam, there are so many verses in the Quran, and there's so many teachings and narrations of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, that talk about the importance of family and how we as individuals, as husband, as wife, as children, as parents, how we deal with one another. The idea of the very word in Arabic of usra, which literally means a protection or a guard, the idea that family is supposed to be, a place of comfort, a place of protection, a place of guard for us. And from the Islamic paradigm, marriage and family, it's a relationship that the Quran talks about. It's a relationship that leads to tranquility. It's a relationship that gives us love and protection and kindness, a place of belonging. It encourages us, it strengthens us. But nevertheless, every community is plagued with domestic abuse. We deal with it, as I mentioned, on a weekly basis at CARE Georgia. We get calls, and then obviously we refer to Noor Family Services. And we are very thankful for the work that you do. But, and another thing interesting is in the Quran, there is actually a chapter called Surah An-Nisa, or the chapter of the woman. And this is very unique because there's not a chapter of the man, right? And in this, where there is guidelines of behavior and code of ethics regarding, care of family, of inheritance, of conflict resolution, of divorce, of marriage itself, of a healthy marriage. And even it talks about, family relations, in-laws, and a lot more. And that's very unique because there's a chapter dedicated to this. And we know that the Prophet Muhammad, there are narrations from him where he forbade his people and his ummah, his nation, from making or finding faults with one another or degrading one another. So when we look at the Islamic paradigm, we see that the Prophet has addressed different types of issues. Financial abuse, he said, it's not permissible. Whether it's physical abuse, it's not permissible, or emotional abuse is not permissible. So with that, we hear a lot about, Sister Faka, we hear a lot about domestic violence. And the typical thing when we hear domestic violence is, God forbid, somebody being physically hurt or being physically battered. When you are dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, and I know it's not, I don't envy your position, may Allah strengthen you in the work that you do in your entire family and the entire Noor Family Services. When you're working with this day to day, how do you define, for our audience, how do you define domestic violence, and what does it entail? If you can clarify that for us.
Right. I think as a practitioner, I'm actually going to go ahead and share my screen with you now. Get that started. So, as a practitioner, I think defining domestic violence for those outside of the industry is actually one of the more difficult aspects, because it is a very amorphous word, and a lot of people don't really understand what it means. So let's break it down. We talk about domestic meaning the family unit within the home generally, but even that can be bigger than that. Certainly in-laws are part of that domestic. It's not just the husband, wife, and children. Domestic can involve a lot of people. And then there's violence. What does violence actually mean? We normally do think of it in terms of physical violence, but what you learn as you work in the industry is that domestic violence is not something that is immediate. It is something that is kind of a workup, because abuse is not something that happens in a sort of emergent moment. Abuse is something that happens over a period of time. So what we talk about with respect to domestic violence, it is a pattern of abusive behavior. What it involves is some form of intimidation. Now, whether that intimidation is in terms of physical threats, so you can have threats of financial abuse in terms of, I'm not going to give you the money that you need to be able to do the bare minimum. It could be immigration abuse in terms of, I am going to report you to immigration authorities if you don't do what I want. And then there's physical assault, putting someone in immediate fear of physical injury. So there are various forms of intimidation that fall within the amorphous category of domestic violence. And what it boils down to is power and control. And we have to ask ourselves, who has the power in this situation? And when we look at the statistics, it is overwhelmingly statistically something that affects women in heterosexual relationships rather than men. Not that it doesn't happen to men, it certainly does happen to men, because what it boils down to is who has the power and how are they using that power to assert control over the other. And when we talk about the other, in this case, we're usually talking about partner violence. There other kinds of violence that also happen against children, against parents, against in-laws, and by in-laws against the daughters-in-law and sons-in-law. So in a nutshell, this is what we're talking about when we talk about domestic violence. Now, you mentioned how in the Quran there is this beautiful narrative really about how we treat each other with equality and respect. And I think domestic abuse, which is that manipulation of power in order to assert control over someone, that is the antithesis of equality and respect that I think is so vital to having a healthy family relationship as decreed by Allah and as practiced by the Prophet himself. What we don't see in examples from Islamic, traditional Islamic teachings is coercive control, which is what abusers use in domestic violence in order to assert their authority and their control over the abuser. And they'll use various machinations to do this. Isolation, degradation, management of, on a very, very micro level of what the other is doing, with the main purpose being to assert that control and dominance over the other party. So I know that's a very long and complicated answer, but I hope that that gives you an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about domestic violence within the industry.
No, definitely. I think that clarifies a lot. And it really goes back to, what we were talking about, that the violence or the idea of control in an Islamic idea or our religious idea of what marriage is, there's no place for it. There's no place for it at all. We see the Prophet Muhammad completely warning us against, and he talked about the blessing of relationship and marriage, and he said, that after faith, after God giving you faith, the second best thing that you can have is a God conscious spouse. And he taught us how to appreciate one another. The Islamic paradigm of marriage, the Quran says, لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا, that you find some sort of belonging, tranquility, love for one another. And when that turns into a battle or a, when they're vying for control, and it's an abusive control, and there's coercion, obviously, that implicates not only just individuals, but families, and also if there are children involved, they get the blunt end of that, So moving on, it's domestic violence is so widespread. It's not only our community, it's something that plagues humanity. And as you said, statistically, we have sisters who suffer more than brothers, although there are brothers. But it's something that plagues society in general, right? Regardless of your background, regardless of anyone's race, gender. What are some of the specific nuances of domestic violence within the Muslim community? Like I said, it's something that's widespread, but we're talking about our own community. What are some of the more nuances that you have seen within our community?
Mm-hmm. So, I think it's a really important point to make that domestic violence is not something that is limited to one socioeconomic wrong of society. It's not limited to any particular gender or to any particular race or any particular community group. It affects all of us, everyone around the world. And, what it boils down to is, we can sit here and we can talk about the beauty and the ideals of our wonderful religion. But at the end of the day, humans are not perfect. Humans are, they are apt to make mistakes. And just like any other human society, the Muslim community also suffers from that. And we do have quite a bit of incidents of domestic violence within the Muslim community. It's very difficult sometimes for me, as I talk about this, to talk about the Muslim community as one whole sort of monolithic group. It's not. There are various communities within the Muslim community. And what I find is that particularly within the immigrant communities that are part of the larger group of Muslim communities in America particularly, we find that one of the biggest issues is fear of law enforcement, fear of authority, such as courts, the fear of stepping outside the bounds of what is considered an acceptable resource for dealing with family relationships. And then there is, of course, a lot of access to resources in terms of language, in terms of ability to find resources, in terms of the independence to be able to do that. Within immigrant Muslim communities, we find a lot of, particularly our clients, because that is what we focus on, We find that there are a lot of our clients who have never driven a car, who have never had a job, who have never had a bank account. And so they don't have a lot of the basic tools necessary to even be able to seek out resources to assist them when dealing with family violence. And then going back, of course, to this fear of law enforcement and the fear of seeking refuge from the legal community, I think perhaps because within the community, we reinforce some of these concerns of, if you go and seek help from the police, you could get deported. It's not unheard of to hear sentiments of that nature. And it causes a lot of anxiety that already exists for survivors of domestic violence who have taken that big step to ask for help. And then on top of it, to fear, well, is my abuser going to take my children away? Is my abuser going to get me deported? Is my abuser ever going to be able to give me what I need in order to support the children? These are all things specific to the immigrant community that we hear. The other thing that I think, anecdotally, I can say when dealing with a lot of Muslim clients is this fear of retribution from the community. There's a lot of concern that if they take the step of leaving the abuser, that they will be shamed by the abuser. And this is not an idle fear, just to make note of it. This is actually something we see a lot where the abuser does, in fact, use the opportunity of a survivor, their spouse leaving an abusive situation, and they take this and use it as a way to isolate the individual. They use the importance of the Muslim community as a place of social it's socially so important to Muslims, I think, with our own community. And so a lot of abusers do, in fact, use shaming and isolation as a tool to assert control. And so what we see is with our own clients, a lot of them will come in and they fear what's going to happen if the community leaves me. What am I going to do if I can't go to the masjid? What am I going to do if my imam thinks that I have been a bad wife? So these nuances, I think, are particularly harmful. And this is something I see specifically with a lot of our Muslim clients, a big concern about how the community is going to react when they find out that they have in fact left an abusive home.
So Sister Faki, I mean, I love how you started off and you said, there's the ideals of our faith, but that's the reality of the lives that we live. And we succumb to our anger, we succumb to our emotions, and we at times, overlook and we overstep boundaries, and, we are then accountable. We are accountable. Now, just on a side note, I want to ask you this. There is a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear, as you said, there's religious misunderstanding. As you said, some may think, well, my husband or my spouse has the right to do that. I have been bad, right?
Yes.
Some may fear the idea of law enforcement. I'm going to get arrested, or my spouse is going to get arrested. And then there is the fear of losing children, and then there's the fear of retribution, the shaming factor that I may, so many different things here. Really, it's really overwhelming just speaking about it right now. So what is your advice? I mean, let's just say, just for the benefit of our viewers right now, and for everyone, what's the reality? What's the reality? We know that these are the nuances, but what's the reality when somebody calls and reaches out to New Family Services? How do you address these fears?
Well, I mean, they're fears, right? Fears are not born out of nothingness. There's always some factual basis for where the fear is coming from. So the very first thing is to understand where our client is coming from. It is a really tough step for a survivor to take to be able to leave an abusive situation. However, there are, in fact, a lot of resources that are available. I'm actually going to try, I'm pretty sure I have some resources, which this is going to tie into what I'm going to be speaking about. So the very first thing is they're going to come and they're going to say, well, where am I going to live, right? How am I going to become safe? How do I ensure my safety and the safety of my children? So the staff at Noor Family Services, or a hotline, if that's what you choose to do, they're trained to deal with these specific concerns, right? Our very first aim is going to be to make sure that you are safe. So there is the physical safety aspect of it, and then there are the legal resources necessary to make you safe as well. And a big part of that is to seek a temporary protective order, which can last anywhere from 30 days to a year, depending on what the court decides. But this is a really important tool to protect survivors. And what it does is, you go into court, and if you are able to show that there has been an act of family violence, you can actually get a stalking temporary protective order too. But I'm gonna limit myself here to acts of family violence. If you can show that there has been an act of family violence and you're able to convince a court that, then you can get this protective order, which will prevent the abuser from coming within a certain space from you. It will give you, it can deal with temporary rights to children. It can deal with, on a temporary basis, issues such as child support. Who is going to live where? What kind of support do you need? So it's sort of a stopgap measure in order to make sure that you have what's necessary to keep you safe. A violation of a protective order can actually result in jail time. It can result in further charges. It can result in some civil remedies too, depending on what the court decides to do. Now, as I mentioned before, for our clients, going to court, it can be a really overwhelming and really scary thing because some of them don't speak English. Some of them don't know how the laws work. They don't know how the courts work. So our aim when you come into Noor Family Services is to kind of explain to you, first of all, to try to communicate with you in a language that you understand, and then communicate what the rules are, what are your rights under the law, what are the courts going to do, what to expect when you go to court. But then the biggest thing is we've got an on-staff attorney who can actually go with you to court. So you are not at it alone. Anybody can walk in and request a temporary protective order, but to go to a hearing and make that proof, it's better if you do it with an attorney. It's not impossible to do by yourself, but it is better to try to go through it with an attorney who understands the process. So I think having that understanding of how the law works and not just the law, criminal laws or family issues, but also immigration-related issues and issues of finances and things of that nature. Giving that sort of global understanding to the client, here are what your rights are, here's what we are going to fight for. And I think giving them that global understanding really puts a lot of our clients at rest. And it really empowers them to be able to go out and seek the resources that do exist. So whether it is in terms of you need immediate shelter, Noor Family Services can provide you with referrals. If you need, if you are not interested in going into a domestic violence shelter, then we can come up with some other strategies. There's a case manager who's there basically to get you where you need to be in order to not feel that anxiety of seeking assistance. On that note, I will say, fear of reaching out to law enforcement is also not an unfounded fear. I completely understand why you would be afraid, particularly in this day and age when walking into a courthouse and being undocumented certainly does put you in danger, I think, in certain places around the US of, well, is somebody going to report me or put an ICE hold on me? So these are all valid fears, but there are, again, protections built into the law for survivors of domestic violence. And if you seek out the help of the experts who know those, they can help you navigate the system so that it doesn't seem as overwhelming as it is. So I hope that kind of helps to explain what it is that, what Noor Family Services can do. And and what issues exist out there for, or what resources exist out there for survivors of domestic violence.
Thank you so much for that. One of the reasons that we decided to address this right now is because we've seen an uptick. Although, again, like I said, we are dealing with civil rights and advocacy, but we've seen an uptick in the calls that we're receiving and the emails that we're receiving dealing with, specifically with domestic abuse and domestic violence. And that's why we reached out to Noor Family Services, with Sister Shama and yourself, and we put this together. And we're hoping to have future programs where we can go more in depth and talk about more specific areas and how we can provide or how Noor Family Services can provide that help to our community as a resource. Before moving on, one of the things that I want to kind of reiterate to the community is that, you're not alone. As Sister Fakia said, if we're going through difficulty, know that you're not alone. We have resources within our community to deal with, these issues. Now, Sister Fakia, there have been quite a few articles that touch upon how COVID, specifically during this entire global pandemic, how this has impacted domestic violence and victims of domestic violence. So what are some of the issues? Some of the issues Noor Family Services has seen during this, global pandemic, and what does COVID mean for domestic violence survivors?
Sure. I actually just realized that there was a question from my last, what I was previously talking about. Do you want me to address that, or shall we wait until the end to discuss that issue of the VAWA?
Yeah, you can address that.
Okay, so I'm very briefly going to talk about VAWA before I talk about sort of the impact of COVID. I'll come back to the impact of COVID on DV victims, because I think it's a really good question about VAWA. So what I mean by VAWA is the Violence Against Women Act. It is actually it's a federal law, which it was passed in order to protect victims of domestic violence. So one of the things that we notice within the immigrant community is the survivor is often the beneficiary of immigrant benefit from the abuser. So the abuser will in fact use that immigration status against the victim and say, if you contact the police, I'm going to have you deported. I'm going to report you to immigration. This happens all the time. And in fact, I've seen people try to do this. The issue is, in fact, if you apply for protection under VAWA with immigration authorities, you can actually apply for family-based. So if the abuser is a U.S. citizen or a green card holder, a U.S. citizen, you can actually apply for a green card without his or her involvement. So you can self-petition under VAWA. And there is actually a provision in VAWA which specifically deals with the abuser calling in to immigration and reporting. So it actually thinks, so it's already forethought the idea that an abuser might try to do this, and so they're specifically trained in expecting those calls, and so they do know how to deal with that. So just briefly, VAWA does in fact provide some pretty serious protections for victims of domestic violence. Now, on to the issue at hand, which is how has COVID really impacted domestic violence victims? So it's really interesting because obviously we are living under new rules, and for most of us, we have been in some form of lockdown or quarantine within the home. Now, if the abuser lives with you, you can imagine what that does for the victim of domestic violence, which is basically you're in lockdown with the person who is abusing you, the person who is putting you in physical or emotional danger. So a lot of the victims of domestic violence are now facing a limited ability to be able to physically distance themselves from the abuser. The abuser is not going to work. Maybe if the victim did before go to work, they're not able to go to work. So everybody's stuck in the home. And as you mentioned in the beginning of the program, under the best of circumstances, you have increased stress with everybody being cooped up together in the same physical space and not being able to get out. And now you've got an abusive spouse with, who's stuck in the same home as the victim. And so who is going to be feeling the impact of that stress? Obviously, it is going to be the victim of domestic violence. You know, even if it's not work, you previously, perhaps the victim or the survivor may have been able to walk out and go to a neighbor's house, or they could have gone to their parents' house. They can't do that anymore. It makes it rather difficult then to find any relief. Then there is the fear of economic stability. A lot of victims of domestic violence remain victims of domestic violence because the fear of financial independence is not there, right? They have always been financially dependent on the abuser, sometimes by happenstance, but most often by design. This is financial abuse is actually a big part of the toolbox of the abuser. It is a way to assert control over someone. So there are increased fears of not being able to get away, even if you are able to step out, even if you are able to make a phone call to the police. What are you going to do if the police shows up and you're not able to communicate with them? Then there is that fear of retribution, because now you're stuck at home and your abuser knows that you tried to leave. So it makes everything rather complicated and it's a very fragile situation. So what we're actually seeing is in the US, there have been fewer calls to law enforcement, which does not mean that there is a lower incidence of domestic violence. There is in fact an increase incidence of violence within the home, but decreased calls. And part of the reason is that abusers often monitor devices. So if you're stuck in the same home, you may not be able to get on a landline, and your cell phone may be being monitored by your abuser. It may be more difficult to send text messages or emails. So it makes it a very, very sort of complicated situation for individuals who are stuck at home with their abusive spouses or other intimate partners. And then, in fact, what we've also seen is the use of COVID to, again, assert control, whether it is in terms of withholding financial resources or saying, I'm not going to take you to the doctor. Now, imagine if you are the victim of abuse and you don't know how to drive and you don't know where the hospital is and you don't know your insurance information. You may not even have insurance and you have no money. What then are you to do? How are you supposed to get any assistance if you are the victim of domestic violence? So that is on a very sort of micro level what the impact of COVID has been on victims. Now, the other issue is that on a bigger level, from the perspective of resources, there has been an impact on COVID as well. So courts are not fully closed, but in Georgia, a judicial emergency has been declared. It was declared back in March, and it has recently been extended through June 12th, which means that court personnel are not working at full capacity. There is minimal staffing within the courthouse. And a lot of the volunteer organizations that work within courthouses to assist victims of domestic violence in filling out temporary protective order applications, for example, they're closed or they're working on very limited capacity. So that means that if an abusive spouse does decide to leave and they go and they want to be able to seek a TPO, they have fewer resources available to them now than they did before the lockdowns happened. We're also seeing a lot of budget cuts at agencies, who may not have as much funding coming in to be able to provide resources. And then, of course, there is the limited resources within law enforcement as well. So law enforcement, often a lot of law enforcement officials are not equipped to handle DV calls anyway, particularly within the immigrant community, although many are. But now we're in a situation where, again, because of lockdown, we have limited personnel, and those limited personnel have to handle all of the stuff that's still happening. And so you may have even more limited resources to divert towards domestic violence calls. And then within hospitals, obviously, most of the medical resources are being diverted towards COVID, which means if you have just been injured by your spouse, then you may choose to just stay at home rather than try to go and get assistance from an urgent care or a hospital. So there are a lot of sort of far-ranging impacts on both victims and the available resources.
I think, yeah, so one of the things that I was going to say is, what is NFS, what is Noor Family Services doing with regards to the lack of availability of resources, or, the obstacles that they may face? What are you doing right now to help and support the community and anybody that's reaching out to you?
Mhm. Well, actually, NFS we have been very, very blessed in that we have been able to keep our doors open. And we've been working night and day to make sure that there isn't an interruption of services to the extent that we can. So we continue to do case management. Our phone calls are still being answered. We continue to provide referrals, and transportation is a big one. So if you decide, for example, to leave your an abusive situation and you don't drive, how do you even get to court to be able to fill out a TPO? That is something that we continue to be able to provide assistance with. We have continued to provide supplies to our current clients and any new clients that come in if they need assistance with food or shelter. All of those resources continue to be provided. But I think perhaps the most important resource that we have continued to provide are the legal services. So if you need assistance with filling out that TPO application, we are an organization that continues to have our doors open for that. If you need somebody to help you fill out that application, we are there. And our attorney continues to be able to go to court with you to help you be able to obtain a 12-month protective order. For a lot of our ongoing clients, so TPOs are not the only legal service that we provide. We also provide direct family law services. So several of our clients continue to have either child support or divorce cases that are pending in court. And with, continuing to have COVID-related issues, sometimes when you're in the middle of the divorce, things become a lot worse. For example, they may stop paying child support, or excuse me, or there may be an escalation in stalking or abusive behavior, even though a legal case is going on. So we continue to assist. If you need to file for an emergency hearing, the attorney can continue to assist you with that, and continue on with your legal case management. So I think for us, we have been very lucky that we are able to continue providing that for our clients. And I urge anybody who knows anybody who needs assistance with any of these issues to certainly reach out to us, because our doors are open.
So one of the things, Sister Fakir, that I'm thinking as I'm listening to you is, first of all, it's a blessing to have Noor Family Services. It's a blessing to have you and your team. One of the things that I have noticed dealing with our own community, the immigrant community, is that sometimes, language is a barrier. How do you deal with that when it comes to language?
So we actually have staff that are fluent in other languages. Our executive director is fluent in Arabic. We have our attorney who's fluent in Urdu, and I believe she speaks Punjabi as well. And then if those three languages are not something that you speak or that doesn't work, we also have Language Line and other interpreters. So all courts, for example, have interpreters available. You just have to ask for them. So that's one of the things that NFS will do for our clients is, we know you have a hearing coming up, we'll make sure that you have an interpreter available in court. But within our office as well, we have Language Line available, so that if you call in and you need to speak to somebody and you speak Amharic and we don't have somebody on staff who speaks it, we'll make sure that we have a digital translation service that's available to get on the call in order to help interpret what the client is saying and what the case manager hears.
Okay, alhamdulillah, perfect. And with the next slide I wanted to ask is, for those suffering from violence and domestic abuse right now at home, what are some of the available resources right now? And I see that you have the slide up, if you can share
I do, and I see that the sun is like coming on my face, so I apologize for how that appears. But yes, we there are available resources. I think one of the, you are always welcome to call Noor Family Services. We're open from 8:30 to 5, and the number is on the screen. You can always email as well. And if you actually go to our website, there's a tab with all available phone numbers and where you can reach out for various things. I've only included a couple here, which is the National DV Hotline, the phone number for shelter if you're seeking shelter within Georgia, and the Suicide Prevention Hotline. So all of these resources are actually available on our website as well. But I think the main thing is, if you are in a situation where you are suffering from family violence and you're looking for specific resources, the best thing is to call our office, speak to a case manager or our ED, and see what specifically you need, and we will figure out a way to make sure that you get that.
Wonderful. Wonderful. One of the last thing that I want to ask you is, for individuals that are out there that may be suffering, but they're afraid of reaching out to you. They're afraid of reaching out to Noor Family Services. What are some encouraging words you can share with us?
Well, first of all, I would like to say you are not alone. I think that's really important for a lot of individuals stuck in violent situations they feel like this is just me and no one will understand. So the first thing I would like to say is that's just not true. We understand, you are not alone, and we are here to support you. The next thing that I would like to say is that we take confidentiality, client confidentiality, extremely, extremely seriously. So if you come to us, if you are an NFS client, we will do everything possible to ensure that the fact that you reached out to us, it remains between you and your case manager, and no one outside of the organization knows it. That having said that, we also have resources to assist you with dealing with some of that anxiety, whether it is a support group for other survivors, or it is a therapist who can speak to you about some of the trauma that you have experienced. We have those available resources. So if you take that step of entrusting us, we will do our utmost to help you through what is one of the most difficult things that you can go through. And I would like to reiterate, you are not alone in this.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you so much, Rafika. It's been a pleasure to have you join us and talk about this very important issue of domestic abuse and domestic violence. We are extremely thankful for all the work that Noor Family Services and you and your team do for the entire community. And again, to our community, please understand that you are not alone. And one of the, the idea of co-victory was to, make available the resources that we have within our community to our families, across the community, so that, we are able to reach out, we're able to educate ourselves and know that at times of need, there are individuals, there are organizations that we can reach out to by the grace of Allah. So I really appreciate, Sister Fakia, you joining us. May Allah bless you, your family, and the entire Noor Family Services. With that, brothers and sisters, I just want to reiterate from the faith perspective, whether it's financial abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, or any other type of abuse, from scriptural point of view, scholars have put them under the category of dhulm, or oppression. And as we know that when it comes to oppression in the Quran, there are different punishments that Allah has outlined or specified for different sins. But when it comes to dhulm and oppression, the punishment has not been specified. Allah has told us that just let them wait. Just let them wait until they stand in front of God. So that admonishment is very concerning, and may Allah protect us and our families. As Muslims, we cannot separate matters of faith and matters of family. We cannot. They're intertwined. They're one and the same. How we deal with our families, it's part of our faith. That defines our faith. So with that, I want to reiterate to our community that there are incidents of men, there are incidents of women that have come to the Prophet, and it's very much present in our legal theory, of domestic, dealing with domestic differences. There are incidents of women that have come to the Prophet, the Messenger of Allah, and spoke about the issues that they're going through, and there was separation and safety that was given to them so that they could live their life with tranquility and safe and sound. There are men that came and the Prophet addressed it. So again, it's not something foreign. So as Sister Fakia reiterated over and over again, understand that this is an issue that plagues humanity, and Muslims were not an exception. However, there is a framework that we have within our community, such as Noor Family Services and the services that they provide, that we can utilize at times of need, at times of difficulty, to find safety, to find tranquility in these storms that we may face. And may Allah protect us and our families. So again, with that, thank you for joining us. Inshallah, we look forward to seeing you next week. Alhamdulillah, may Allah bless all of you, your families. May Allah keep us safe. May Allah keep our families safe. And until next time, please keep us in your dua. Make dua for the Co-Victory Initiative. Make dua for Sister Fakia and the NFS family. And again, if you want to know more, I would say please reach out to them. Just get to know more. Sometimes it's beneficial to know just because maybe it'll come in handy because of someone else that you may come in contact with. And I know if I have been able to help or be there for other individuals and families because I know Noor Family Services. There are times where people call us as an individual, whether it's me, Abdullah Jabir, or Kira Georgia, and we're able to refer them because we have that information at hand. So again, know that Noor Family Services, they're there for you, they're there for our community. And again, please keep them in your dua. And inshallah, we look forward to seeing you next week. Until then, stay strong. Enjoy the blessed month of Ramadan as we are just speeding through it. Half of the month is gone. We're in the last portions of it. May Allah accept our endeavor. May Allah increase us in our faith internally and externally. Until next time, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum.